The sentence came down hard and fast, the way all sentences did in the border court at Ashfin, with a bang of iron on wood and no room left for breath. "Death," said Magistrate Dalvin, and the word landed in the crowded hall like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through every man and woman packed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. By hanging before the next full moon for the crime of trespass within the sovereign boundary, destruction of Crown survey equipment, and assault upon 2 officers of the survey line. Simon Holloway had been standing near the back of the hall with a bundle of marten pelts slung over one shoulder and no particular intention of opening his mouth. He was a fur trader by profession and a quiet man by inclination, 28 years old, lean, and wind-burned from months in the deep ranges east of the Grayville River, where the Orc clans ran their territories. He had come to Ashfin to sell furs and resupply and be gone again within 2 days, and instead he had walked into the back of this sweltering hall, because the noise from the crowd had drawn him through the door. And now, he was watching an Orc woman stand in chains before the bench with her head straight and her jaw set, and her dark green eyes fixed on the magistrate like she was the judge and not the condemned. She was the most striking person he had ever seen in a courtroom. That was the first thing he thought, plainly and without ceremony. She stood perhaps 6 feet and 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered and built like something hammered out of good iron. Yet the lines of her were unmistakably feminine, the sweep of her waist above her hips, the proud angle of her shoulders, the long, elegant column of her throat above the iron collar. She wore travel leathers that had been cut and fitted to her frame with real care. A close-fitted bodice of dark oiled leather laced up the front with cord the color of old bronze, paired with snug riding trousers of the same material that disappeared into calf-high boots stitched with a running stitch of green thread. A strip of braided leather held the mass of her dark hair back from her face, and on her left wrist below the manacle, a cuff of hammered copper caught the lamplight. Her tusks were modest, barely clearing her lower lip, the points faintly worn, and the planes of her face were striking rather than rough, wide-set eyes beneath a strong brow, a flat, broad nose, full mouth pressed now into a flat, furious line. A long scar ran from her left cheekbone down toward the corner of her jaw, and she wore it the way some women wore jewelry, without apology. She did not look afraid. She looked outraged and barely bothering to hide it. "Death," Dalvin said again, as if he enjoyed the taste of it. Simon heard himself speak before he had consciously decided to. On what basis? The hall went quiet the way halls go quiet when someone does something unexpected and possibly stupid. Dalvin looked up. Several guards looked toward the back. The Orc woman looked, for the first time, away from the magistrate straight across the crowded room to the fur trader who had no business speaking. "Who addresses this court?" Dalvin said. "Simon Holloway, licensed trader, Eastern Range Charter." Simon had set his pelts down against the wall by then and was pushing through the crowd toward the front, which was either very brave or very foolish. He was not sure which. "I trade east of the Grayville. I know the survey lines. I also know they have been moved twice in the last year without formal announcement, which means I'd like to know which line this woman is accused of crossing, and when, and whether the officers who surveyed it can prove it was legally marked at the time." Dalvin stared at him. "This is not a debate. No, it is a court, which means evidence matters." Simon reached the open floor in front of the bench, and stood there in his road-worn coat with his jaw set, and his hands quiet at his sides, keeping his voice even with the particular effort of a man who is frightened, but has decided not to show it. "Royal Charter governing Orc territorial agreements, signed at the Thornwall Accord, requires a 20-foot marked boundary with painted stones before any survey line is legally enforceable against Orc clan residents. I have walked those ranges. I know what the markers look like when they are placed correctly, and I know what they look like when they are planted after the fact. If the Crown wants to hang this woman, the Crown can produce the original survey record with the stone placement logged and dated." The hall buzzed. He could hear it behind him, the whisper and shuffle of people recalculating what they were watching. Dalvin leaned forward. "Are you an attorney, Holloway?" "No. I am a man who reads his charters because he has to." The magistrate was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at the two survey officers who were standing off to the left, looking considerably less certain than they had been a few minutes ago. One of them leaned toward the other and said something low. Neither of them looked at the orc woman. Dalvin sat back. "The court will review the survey documentation before sentencing is finalized. The accused will be remanded to—" "She should not be remanded." Simon kept his voice level. "She has committed no proven crime, and she is being held in chains in a Crown facility under a death sentence that has not been substantiated. That is not how the charter works. Reduce the sentence to exile, release her into recognizance, and let the survey review proceed." The silence this time was different, heavier. "Exile," Dalvin said at last, as if he were tasting something he had not expected. "From the survey territory. She agrees not to re-enter. You agree not to hang her for something you cannot prove. That is a deal that holds up, magistrate." Dalvin looked at the survey officers again. Neither of them spoke. He banged the iron. "Sentence reduced to exile from the Crown survey territory east of the Grayville, first boundary marker north to south. Prisoner to be released within the hour." He looked directly at Simon. "I trust you will see her to the boundary." "I will," Simon said, and he had not entirely planned to say that either. He turned around. The orc woman was watching him with an expression that was complex and carefully controlled, the kind of look a person gives when they are working out whether they are grateful or offended or both. The iron collar had not been removed yet and her wrists were still chained, but her eyes moved over him the way a good scout moves over terrain, quickly, precisely, with no wasted motion. "You know the Thornwall Accord," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected and clear, with the precise consonants of someone who had learned the common tongue deliberately rather than growing up in it. "I know the parts that protect my route." "Convenient," she said. "Was it wrong?" She considered him for another moment. "No." Her name, he learned while the court clerk was removing her chains in the side room and a guardsman was logging her release, was Sharamph Ironhide, and she was second-range scout for the Ironhide clan, which held territory in the deep east along the Crookback Ridge. She had come west to find out why the survey lines had been moving, because 3 members of her clan had already been arrested, and 2 of them had not come back, and she had apparently decided that the best way to investigate was to follow the surveyors herself, which had resulted in a confrontation when one of the surveyors noticed he was being followed and swung a chain at her, and she had disarmed him with exactly the amount of force necessary and no more. And his partner had fled and reported it as an assault. "They hit me first," she said, pulling the copper cuff back onto her wrist once the manacle was gone. Her tone was not plaintive. It was simply factual, the way a person states the color of the sky. "I believe you," Simon said. She looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because the one who reported the assault did not have a single bruise on him when he stood up in that courtroom, and men who have actually been attacked by an orc scout do not come away looking like they had a pleasant afternoon." Her mouth moved. It was almost a smile. Almost. She had nothing to collect. The court had already released her pack and her belt knife, a serious blade with a bone handle worn smooth from use, and she slung the pack over one shoulder and settled the knife at her hip with the ease of a person putting on a part of themselves. And then she looked at Simon with a directness that he found considerably more uncomfortable than anything the magistrate had said. "You are the fur trader," she said. "Simon Holloway. You range east of the Grayville. For 7 years. I have heard the name." She said it without inflection, neither complimentary nor dismissive, but it meant she had asked about him, or someone had mentioned him, and he was not sure what to do with that, so he picked up his pelts from the hall wall and settled them over his shoulder and said, "The boundary is half a day's ride east. My wagon is at the livery." They walked through Ashfin together, which drew looks. It always drew looks when a human and an orc walked together through a border town, And Simon had been drawing looks of that variety for 7 years, and had made his peace with it. He walked at an easy pace with his pelts over his shoulder, and did not look at anyone looking at them, and Sharamph walked beside him with the measured, deliberate stride of someone who is aware they are being watched, and does not intend to give anyone the satisfaction of reacting to it. At the livery, he introduced her to his horse, a heavy-set roan gelding named Merchant, which made her eyebrow go up, and offered to let her ride while he drove the wagon east. "I walk faster than a wagon," she said. "I know, walk beside it then." She did. The road east of Ashfin ran through thinning farmland before it opened into the rough borderlands, wide flat country of pale grass and gray stone ridges, and the occasional stand of birch silver-white against the afternoon sky. Simon drove with his reins loose in his hands and the pelt stacked behind him in the wagon bed, and said very little for the first hour, because he was in the habit of letting silences run until they needed to be filled, and Sharamph said nothing at all, which he found surprisingly companionable. It was she who broke the silence, eventually, and when she did it was not the question he had been expecting. "The survey lines," she said. "You said they moved." "I said a year. 40 feet east the first time, 60 feet east the second. If it keeps going at that pace, by next spring the legal survey boundary will run through 3 orc family encampments and a clan burial ground." She was quiet for a moment. "You notice this? It affects my route. If the legal boundary moves, my charter becomes worthless because I can't trade in territory the Crown is claiming, and the clans won't trade with me in territory they're being pushed off of." He glanced at her. "I noticed it for selfish reasons, and you know who is behind it. I have a good guess. There is a lord named Carrick Hale who holds a prospecting grant for the Crookback Ridge, and the survey lines have been moving precisely in the direction his grant would need them to move in order to give him legal access to the eastern mineral beds." Simon kept his voice matter-of-fact. "I can't prove it." Sharamph was looking ahead at the road. The afternoon light was long and golden, and it caught the planes of her face in a way that made it harder than usual to look somewhere else. "The Ironhide clan's war leader sent me west to find out what was happening," she said. "I was to gather information, bring it back, and then the war leader would decide whether to invoke the Thornwall Accord's arbitration clause or go to war." She paused. "He did not account for the possibility that I would be arrested. What happens if you go back empty-handed?" "Nothing good." She turned and looked at him directly, and up close her eyes were a deep shade of dark green, the color of deep forest water, with a directness in them that he found himself not wanting to look away from. "What happens to your route if there is a war?" "I lose it. Every human trader east of the Greyville loses their charter because the Crown will conscript the roads and block civilian access." He met her gaze. "Which means I would like there not to be a war." "We agree on something," Sharamph said. They reached the boundary marker at dusk, a tall stone post painted with a red stripe that looked considerably newer than it should have, which was itself evidence, and Simon pulled Merchant to a stop and sat for a moment looking at it. "The Exile boundary," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "The Exile says you cannot return to Crown Survey territory east of the Greyville first boundary marker north to south, which is here." He pointed at the stone post. "Everything east of this post is still Orc territory under the Thornwall Accord. The Exile does not cover it." She looked at the post. She looked at him. "That is a very precise reading," she said. "I am a very careful man with legal documents." A pause, then, "I need to bring proof back to the Ironhide war leader, proof of what Carrick Hale is doing. If I go back with nothing, there will be a war regardless of whether I want one." Simon had been sitting with that thought for the last 2 hours of the road, turning it over the way he turned over a questionable trade offer looking for the catch. "I know someone," he said, "a woman named Darville Oust. She runs the resupply post at Fort Crail, which is a half-ruined fort on the edge of the Crookback Range that a group of settlers have been trying to get back on its feet for the last 3 years. She is also, incidentally, the most organized archivist in 400 miles, and she has been quietly collecting survey records for the last 2 years because she does not trust Carrick Hale either. If anyone has the documented proof of what the survey lines have done, and when, she does. Sharamph looked at him, and Fort Crail is how far? 4 days' travel northeast, through the rough country, through Orc territory. Yes. A human fur trader and an exiled Orc scout traveling through Orc territory to retrieve documents proving a human lord is cheating the Orc clans. She said it flat, without editorial, and he could not entirely tell whether she was cataloging the absurdity or accepting the logic. I would also be able to trade at 3 clan stops along the way, Simon said, which was true and also a way of pointing out that he was not doing this purely out of charity. The sun was fully down now, and the boundary post stood between them and the eastern dark, and Sharamph Ironhide stood on the far side of it with her pack over her shoulder and her knife at her hip and the fading copper light of the sky behind her, and she looked at Simon Holloway for a long time in the particular way she had of looking at him, which was as if she were calculating something and was nearly done. "I know the roads to Fort Crail," she said at last. "You do not." "That is very likely true." "If I lead, you keep pace." "I will keep pace." She stepped back from the boundary post, east into the open territory, and did not look back at him to see if he would follow. She did not need to. He clicked to merchant and turned the wagon northeast off the road, onto the rougher country, and followed her. The first night they camped in a dry ravine with a fire that she built in the approved manner for the eastern range, small, contained, no green wood, no visible from above, and Simon made tea in a battered copper pot and offered her a cup, and she accepted it without ceremony and drank it with her knees drawn up and her eyes on the fire with a thoughtful, settled quality that he had begun to recognize as simply how she was when she was not in motion. She was not a person who fidgeted. She occupied whatever space she was in with a completeness that he found restful, which was not the word he would have predicted. "The war leader's name is Ironhide," she said, apropos of apparently nothing, looking at the fire. "He is my father's brother. He is a good war leader in most ways, which means he is thinking about this entirely in terms of war because that is the tool he knows best. But he does not want war either. He wants a reason not to have it. He wants something he can take to the Thornwall Arbitration Council and say, 'Here, this is evidence. We bring a case before a neutral body and we win without blood.'" She turned the cup in her hands. "That is what the documents at Fort Crail could be." "I know," Simon said. "Then you understand why I am not going back to my clan without them." "I understand perfectly." He looked at her across the fire. "I also understand that an arbitration case needs a human advocate, someone who can stand in front of the council and speak to the legality of the survey records, who has personal knowledge of the route and the changes." She looked at him. The fire made shadows move across her face. "That would be you," she said. "It would be me," Simon said. "If you wanted it to be." Another silence, a different kind. He watched her decide something. "Go to sleep, Simon Holloway," she said. "Tomorrow is a long day." He lay back on his bedroll and looked up at a sky so thick with stars that it seemed impossible, and he listened to the night sounds of the eastern range, which he knew as well as his own heartbeat, the wind in the dry grass, the distant crying of something that was definitely not a wolf but made a similar sound, and he thought about what he had done today, which was stand up in a courtroom for a woman he had never met, and where that had gotten him, which was here, in a ravine in the borderlands. And he found that he had no complaints about any of it. He fell asleep faster than he expected to. The second day was harder. The route Sharamph took cut north through broken country, leaving the flat grass behind for a landscape of tumbled granite ridges and scrub pine, and long slopes of loose shale that made merchant blow and pick his feet with theatrical care. She moved through it with the efficiency of someone who has spent a great deal of time in terrain exactly like this, choosing the paths that looked impossible and turned out to be merely difficult. And Simon followed her with the patience that 7 years of trading had built into him like a physical thing. At one of the ridgelands they stopped and she pointed east, and in the middle distance he could see barely, as a smudge of disturbed ground and a glint of metal, what looked like a survey party, 3 men, a pack mule, a set of those iron-shod measuring rods. Hale's men, she said, moving east, already past where the last markers were placed. Simon looked at the survey party and then at the surrounding terrain. They are heading toward the burial ground. Yes, her voice was even, but her jaw had tightened. If they mark there, the Ironhide clan will have no choice. Gorek will read it as a deliberate provocation, which it is, and he will send the warband. How much time do we have? If they mark the burial ground 3 days, maybe 4 before the warband rides. Simon did the math. Fort Crail was 2.5 days away on his most optimistic estimate. That left no margin. We move faster, he said. Yes, said Sharamph. She did not add anything comfortable to soften it. That night she showed him the clan stop she had been planning, a small settlement of 3 family groups under a granite overhang, half-walled with dry stone, and he traded 2 marten pelts and a coil of good rope for fresh bread and dried venison and grain for merchant, which was the cleanest and most uncomplicated trade he had made in recent memory, and the orc woman who ran the stop. A gray-haired matriarch named Vess with scarred forearms and sharp eyes spoke to Sharamph in the Ironhide dialect for a long time, too fast and complex for Simon to follow, and then looked at him with the particular appraisal of someone who has heard something they were not sure they believed. Sharamph translated none of it. She simply thanked Vess, took the bread, and walked back to where Simon was hitching Merchant to a picket. She says she has heard of you, Sharamph said. Most of the clan stops along this route have. She says the fur trader Holloway is reliable, does not short measure, and has never carried a message for the crown. She handed him a piece of the bread. She did not know you were the man from the court today. How did she already know about the court? The Eastern Range talks fast, Sharamph said, and there was something in her voice that sounded, just faintly, like warmth. Simon ate the bread and did not say anything else about it, but he was aware, in the way that a person becomes aware of a change in the weather before they can name it, that something in how she looked at him had shifted over the course of the day. Not dramatically, not in a way he was sure he was reading correctly, just a degree of directness that was different somehow from the tactical assessment she had been making of him since the courthouse. On the 3rd morning she caught him doing something he would not have admitted to doing, which was watching her move. She had been up before him and was breaking down the fire and repacking her bedroll with a quick, practiced efficiency, and she was simply worth watching, the clean mechanics of a person who knew exactly what they were doing in their body, and he had been watching for perhaps 5 seconds before she turned and caught him at it. He looked away. She did not say anything. But when she handed him the water skin a few minutes later, there was a quality to the silence between them that had changed again, and he had the distinct sense that she had noticed, filed it away, and drawn some conclusion, and that the conclusion was not unfavorable. By midday on the 3rd day they were high enough in the Crookback foothills that the air had gone sharp and cold, and the trees had shifted from scrub pine to proper fir, dark and tall and close together, and the road, what passed for a road, an old cart track overgrown to a thread, began to climb seriously. Simon kept Merchant to a walk and matched his pace to Sharamph's. "Tell me about Fort Crail," she said. Built about 80 years ago as a frontier garrison, abandoned 30 years back when the Crown pulled the Western forces east for the Salt War. A woman named Oust arrived about 3 years ago with a group of settlers who had been displaced by the same survey line politics we're dealing with now, lost their land to a boundary redraw, and moved to the edge of the map to start again. They have a great hall, 2 working towers, a mill they got running last autumn, and about 40 people. Simon guided Merchant around a root snarl. "Darville Oust runs it. She is the most practical person I have ever met, and she does not like Carrick Hale, which makes her our best ally. Is it walled?" "Half. The south and east walls are in fair repair. The north is open. They have been rebuilding. So 40 people half-walled at the edge of the range." Sharamph was looking at the trail ahead. "If Hale knows we are going there, he does not know we are going there. He will when his surveyors report that someone was watching them from the ridge." Simon thought about that. "You are right. "I usually am," Sharamph said. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead, and the corner of her mouth had moved, and he realized he was grinning and did not bother to stop. It was in the late afternoon of the third day that the trail crossed the Exiled River on an old timber bridge, and it was here that the story nearly ended in a way that neither of them would have chosen. The Exiled had been running high. Simon had seen it from the ridge above, the unusual brown color of snowmelt-fed water, quick and full-channeled. But the bridge had looked solid from a distance, its big timber crossbeams dark with old weathering and apparently sound. He drove Merchant onto it first because he always led with the wagon on uncertain crossings, getting a sense of the structure before committing a heavier load. And Merchant went willingly enough because Merchant was brave in the specific way that large, placid animals are brave, which is by not fully understanding what they should be afraid of. They were perhaps 2/3 of the way across when the upstream pier gave way. It was not a gradual thing. It was sudden and total, the kind of structural failure that happens when old timber has been undermined by moving water and is holding together by habit and then stops. The upstream side of the bridge dropped a foot with a crack that Simon felt in his teeth before he heard it, and Merchant screamed, which was a sound he had never heard from that particular horse and never wanted to hear again. And then the whole surface tilted hard to the right, and the wagon lurched sideways, and Simon went off the seat and hit the bridge railing and felt it flex horribly beneath his weight. What happened next happened in pieces. He heard Sharamph shout his name, Simon. Short and sharp and very close, which meant she had already been coming onto the bridge behind him when the pier went. He got an arm over the railing and looked down into brown, moving water 12 feet below. He heard the groan of the remaining timbers. Then her hand closed around his wrist, and it was not a gentle grip. It was the grip of someone who has no intention of letting go of something, full strength, iron certain. And she hauled him back from the railing with a force that moved him bodily, which was not a thing most people could have done because he was not a small man. And she did it without apparent effort, pulling him toward the bank end of the bridge as the tilting surface continued its slow, terrible lean. Merchant had already made his own decision. The horse had lunged forward when the pier dropped, half dragging the wagon with him on a surface that was no longer level, guided entirely by his own instinct for survival, and he hit the far bank as the bridge dropped its remaining 6 feet into the river, not breaking fully but dropping to 45 degrees, a ramp of wet splintered timber into brown churning water. And the wagon hit the bridge surface and scraped and tilted, and the back left wheel dropped off the edge, and the whole thing came to a stop at an insane angle with Merchant on the bank, still standing, blowing hard, eyes white-trimmed, and the wagon hanging off the side of what was left of the bridge with its load of furs and supplies half in the river. Simon and Sharamph were on the bank. He was not entirely sure how. She still had his wrist. They stood there for a moment in the aftermath of it, the bridge groaning its last behind them, the river running fast and unconcerned around the fallen timber, and he became aware that his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his hands, and that she was breathing fast, and that her grip on his wrist had not loosened. "Merchant," he said. His voice came out strange. "The horse is standing," she said. Her voice was steadier than his. "The wagon, I can see the wagon." He turned to look. "We have to get it up before the remaining weight takes it in." "Yes." She let go of his wrist. They got the wagon up. It took an hour, both of them in the river to the knee despite the cold, using ropes from his pack and a sapling she cut and trimmed and deployed as a lever with the easy authority of someone who has done field engineering before, and Merchant contributing exactly as much pulling as was needed, and no more because Merchant had had enough excitement for one afternoon. The wagon came up mud-soaked and with a broken rear axle pin that would need replacing, but the furs were saved, wrapped in oilcloth as they always were on his wagon, and his tools were saved, and the documents they would need at Fort Crail were, crucially, not yet in their possession and therefore had not been at risk. When it was done, they stood on the bank in the last of the afternoon light, both of them soaked to the knee and breathing hard, and Sharamph looked at the ruined bridge for a long time. "That could have killed you," she said. "You pulled me back," Simon said. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was different from all her previous expressions, less controlled, more exposed, and he thought she was about to say something, and then she did not, and instead she bent and wrung out the hem of her riding trousers with a businesslike efficiency and said, "We make camp here. Fix the axle pin in the morning. There is a ford half a mile downstream that will hold the wagon." "All right," Simon said. They made camp on the bank. The fire was larger than usual, because they were both wet and the night was cold, and he did not remark on the deviation from the small fire rule, and she did not explain it. He dug a spare axle pin from his tool kit and laid it where he would have it in the morning, and she checked the ropes on the wagon bed and confirmed everything that mattered was still there, and then they sat on either side of the fire with their boots off and their feet near the heat, and the silence between them was not the same kind of silence it had been on the first night. It was closer, warmer, the kind of silence that contains rather than separates. He was thinking about her hand on his wrist. He thought it was possible she was thinking about it too. "The first time I came east of the Grayville," he said, "I was 21 and I did not know what I was doing. I had a mule and 30 pounds of finished rope, and an address for a clan stop I had found written in the margins of a dead trader's route journal, and I rode east and I just kept going because I had no particular reason to stop." He looked at the fire. "It was the first time I had been somewhere that was genuinely mine. No family expectation, no town, no one who had known me since I was a child and had a fixed idea of what I was. Just the range and the trade and whoever I happened to meet." She was listening. He could feel it without looking. "I think that is why the route matters to me in a way that is more than just money," he said. "I am not sure I know how to be myself anywhere else." The fire shifted. She turned a stick in the coals. "The Ironhide clan's territory," she said, "has been in the same 5 ridges since before the first crown surveyors arrived. My grandmother was born there, her grandmother before her." A pause. "I grew up knowing every path through those ridges. Every water source, every den, every rock face that tells you the weather 3 days ahead. When I dream those ridges." Her jaw tightened slightly. The idea of it being marked off on a crown survey map, put behind a line, made into something Carrick Hale can take, I cannot make myself think of it as something that might simply happen. It is not possible to accept. "I know," Simon said. "You do not know the way I know it." "No," he said, "not the way you know it, but I know that what you are feeling is correct, that it is worth fighting for." She looked at him across the fire. The light moved across her face and she looked at him with that dark green water directness, and she said, "Why did you speak in that courtroom?" It was not quite a question. It was the question she had been sitting with since Ashfin. He thought about it honestly. "Because you were standing there in chains and the sentence was wrong." "And because I knew it was wrong and I had the information to say so." He met her gaze. "I did not think about it much beyond that. Most humans would not have." "No? Why are you different?" "I spend a great deal of time in other people's territories," he said. "You learn that the person in front of you is a person, or you do not learn that and you are less than what you could be." The fire crackled. Something moved in the firs behind them, small and inconsequential. "Simon Holloway," she said, and his name in her voice had a quality to it that sat differently than anything else had, careful and deliberate, like she was setting something down. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for the court." "You are welcome." He paused. "Thank you for not letting me go into the river." She made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, brief and genuine, the first real laugh he had heard from her, and it changed her face in a way that did something unusual to his chest, and she looked away at the fire again, but the corner of her mouth was still up, and he thought that was possibly the best thing that had happened to him in a very long time. They reached Fort Crail on the afternoon of the 4th day. It sat at the base of the Crookback Ridge proper, a cluster of old stone buildings within a wall that was indeed half repaired, the north gap filled in with timber palisade as a temporary measure. two round towers standing solid, smoke coming from what was clearly a smithy on the south side. It was a working place, lived in and purposeful, with haystacks near the gate and chickens in the yard, and a group of children who were, at the moment of their arrival, being chased out of the smithy by a red-faced man who was neither violent nor convincing about it. The gate was open. Darvel Oust met them in the yard before they had finished tying Merchant to the post. She was a small, compact woman of perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair wound tight and a face that had been outdoors for most of its life, and she looked at Sharamph with a frank and unafraid curiosity that Simon found characteristically refreshing. "Holloway," she said, "you look like you had a difficult crossing." "The Keld bridge is down," he said. "Darvel, this is Sharamph Ironhide, scout for the Ironhide clan." "I know the clan," Darvel said, and she looked at Sharamph with the same directness she used for everything, and Sharamph looked back with an equal directness, and some wordless assessment occurred between two competent women that Simon had the wisdom to stay out of. "We need your survey records," Sharamph said. "What you have collected on the Grayville line movement, all of it." "I know you do," Darvel said. "Come inside." The archive was in the main hall, in 4 locked chests that proved to contain an extraordinary amount of material. Survey records, correspondence, dated delivery receipts for survey equipment, a log of crown payments to a private surveying firm, and 2 letters that appeared to be between Carrick Hale and the lead surveyor that were, had they been any more direct about what they were discussing, essentially a confession. Simon and Sharamph sat across a table from Darvel and went through it together, Darvel reading out dates and figures, Simon cross-referencing against his own route records, and Sharamph building a sequential map on a sheet of old paper that showed, movement by movement and date by date, the illegal creep of the survey line eastward into Ironhide territory over 16 months. "This is enough," Simon said, after 2 hours. He looked at the assembled papers. "This is more than enough. An arbitration council sees this. Hale loses his prospecting grant and potentially his lordship. The arbitration council has never ruled against a crown charter lord on behalf of an orc clan," Sharamph said. She was still looking at the map. "No," Simon said, "but the Thornwall Accord requires them to if the evidence is presented by a human legal advocate with personal knowledge. The language is very specific." He looked at her, "which is where I come in." She looked up from the map. "You would take this to the arbitration council." "I have to. That is the mechanism. An orc representative cannot file with the council under the current charter structure. It requires a human co-petitioner. Without that, the evidence means nothing legally, even if it damns Hale completely." He leaned forward, putting his forearms on the table. "I will be the co-petitioner. I have personal route knowledge, I have 7 years of documented trade in the affected territory, and I have the legal standing. All I need is the documents and someone to tell me where the council sits." "Thornwall," Darvel said. 2 days west." 2 days west," Simon said. He looked at Sharamph. "The war band, what is the timeline now?" She had been calculating it quietly. "If the surveyors marked the burial ground day before yesterday, then Gorek will have the report by tomorrow. He will take 1 day to prepare, which means the war band rides the day after tomorrow. We need to get a message to him. We need to get the documents to Thornwall." "Both," Darvel said, and they both looked at her, and she was already at the other end of the hall calling for a young man named Pell who turned out to be fast on horseback and willing to ride east with a message for the Ironhide war leader if Sharamph wrote it and explained the route. Which Sharamph did, writing in the Ironhide script with a hand that Simon noticed was steady and precise, and the message was brief: "Hold, we have evidence. Give us 4 days," and Pell was gone within the hour. "And now," Darvel said, setting bread and a pot of something thick and hot on the table without ceremony, "you eat. Both of you, and then you sleep in actual beds which you clearly need, and you leave for Thornwall at dawn." Simon looked at Sharamph. She was looking at the bread with an expression that suggested she was not going to argue with Darvel Oust about anything. "Thank you," Simon said. "The fort has room," Darvel said. We have been rebuilding it precisely so it has room for people who need it. She went back to her fire. And Holloway, fix your axle pin. Pell will show you where the spare parts are kept. The beds were in the north tower, 2 rooms with plank floors and straw pallets and wool blankets, and they were the best thing Simon had slept on since Ashfin, and he was asleep within minutes of lying down and did not stir until the fort bell rang at first light. He found Sharamph already in the yard in the gray morning, standing at the fence with a cup of something hot in her hands and looking east at the Crookback Ridge. The first light was coming in over it, pale gold touching the high rock faces, and she was watching it with an expression that was so open and unguarded that he stopped for a moment before she heard him and composed herself. She turned. The morning light was good to her. It always was, he had been noticing, in the way that morning light is good to faces built on strong planes and clean angles, and she was fully awake in the way of a person whose sleep was efficient, and she handed him the extra cup she had been holding without a word, which meant she had heard him coming and had poured it for him, and that small thing was somehow more intimate than a great many larger things. "The ridge," she said, looking back at it. "Ironhide territory," he said. "From here you can see the first 2 of the boundary peaks. The one with the broken top is called Gorek's Thumb, a different Gorek, the war leader's grandfather. And the flat-topped one to the left is called the Anvil. I have been to the summit of both of them." She paused. "When I was 17, I climbed the Anvil with my cousin Shressa in a blizzard because Shressa bet me I would not. I nearly did not come back from that one." "What was the bet?" "Shressa's good belt knife." She looked at the cup in her hands. "She was killed 3 years ago in a border skirmish. A different survey line dispute, different territory. The knife was the last thing she gave me." She touched the bone-handled blade at her hip briefly with 2 fingers. "So you understand why this is personal." "I do," Simon said, "and why I cannot go back to the clan without winning this." "You will," he said. He said it without qualification because he meant it without qualification, and she looked at him with a complicated expression, and then she straightened and finished her cup in one swallow. "The road to Thornwall," she said. "Let us go," he said. The road to Thornwall ran west along a river road that was in considerably better repair than anything they had traveled to reach Fort Crail, which was both a relief and a reminder that they were moving back into heavily human territory. Simon felt the change in how people looked at them at the first waypost town they passed through. Not dramatically, not with open hostility, but with the particular set of the shoulders, and the gaze slightly too long or pointedly too short that he recognized as the human border country response to an orc, in a place they had not expected one. Sharamph walked through it with the same measured containment she had shown in Ashfin, and he matched her pace and kept his own face easy and did not look at anyone sideways, and nobody said anything that required him to say anything back. On the first night west of Fort Crail, she told him about the Arbitration Council. "I have heard it argued," she said, "that the Thornwall Accords Council has never truly been neutral, that it was always designed to resolve disputes in the Crown's favor in the long run, and that the mechanism of requiring a human co-petitioner is specifically intended to prevent orc clans from ever having standing." "That may be true of how it was designed," Simon said. "I think it was true of how it was used for the first 40 years. But the current senior arbitrator is a woman named Merritt Dunstan, and she is known for ruling on the evidence, and I believe that is because she watched her predecessor rule against the evidence twice, and it ended in wars that cost considerably more than the prospecting grants they were protecting." He looked at the fire. "I am not going to tell you the system is fair. I am going to tell you that right now, with these documents and this specific arbitrator, we have a real chance. And you know Merritt Dunstan. I met her once 4 years ago at a border market. She was looking at otter pelts. We had a 15-minute conversation about waterway rights." He paused. "She is rigorous. If we present this correctly, she will rule on the merits. You are very confident for a man who is riding to challenge a lord's grant with 4 days to stop a war." "I know," Simon said. He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" She looked back at him, and the firelight was between them, and she was very still for a moment in that particular way she had. Then she said, "No, I find I do not want you to be less confident." The second night before Thornwall, they camped on the river road where the willows made a green corridor over the water, and the night air smelled of warm grass and the last of the season's wildflowers. And something had shifted between them that had been building since the bridge. She had been sitting closer to him at the evening fire than strictly necessary. He had been looking at her more openly than he had allowed himself before, and she had been looking back in the same way. He had been thinking about her since Ashfin, if he was honest, in the particular way a person thinks about someone who has become, quickly and without fanfare, the most interesting person in the room. More than that. The way she moved and the way she thought and the way she had handed him a cup of hot tea in the gray morning at Fort Crail, as if it were obvious and ordinary, all of it had been accumulating in him like weight, the good kind, the kind that grounds rather than burdens. She was the one who moved. He should have known she would be. She shifted along the log they were sitting on, closing the remaining distance, and looked at him sidelong with an expression that was somewhere between assessing and deliberate, and said, "I am going to say something." "All right," he said. "When I was in that courtroom in Ashfin, I had already decided that if they convicted me I would die on my feet and they would know they had fought for every inch of it." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything. "I was not waiting for someone to save me. I did not need to be saved." "I know," he said, "but you spoke anyway." "Yes, not because you thought I needed rescuing. No, because the sentence was wrong and you were right and I had the tools to say so." "You would have done the same if our positions had been reversed." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I would have. I know." She turned to look at him fully, close enough that he could see the fine detail of her face in the firelight, the scar, the strong brow, the dark green eyes with their unflinching quality, and she said, "I do not trust easily. I know that too. I am telling you so that you understand that when I say I trust you, it means something." He held her gaze. "I understand." She reached out and took his hand, her large, warm hand around his, and held it with that iron-certain grip that he remembered from the bridge. And then her grip softened and became something else entirely, something careful and deliberate and warm. She turned his hand over in hers, looking at it, the trail-roughened palm and the ink stain on his right forefinger from the charter documents he carried. "You are a strange man, Simon Holloway," she said. "You are small and quiet, and you read legal documents for pleasure." "I am not that small," he said. "You are by my standards." Her mouth curved. "I do not mean it as a complaint." He laughed. It came out more easily than he expected. "Good." She lifted her eyes to his. "I want to know you," she said. It was the plainest possible way to say it, and it was not a hedge or a hint. It was simply a statement of intention from a woman who did not hedge. "I want to know who you are in all the ways, not just the legal documents and the fur trade, the whole of you." He turned his hand in hers and held back, and she looked at their joined hands, and something shifted in her expression, opened slightly, the controlled surface giving way to something underneath that was less defended and more real. "You already know more of me than most people I have known for years," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am aware that is unusual." He leaned toward her, and she did not move away. And when he kissed her, it was unhurried and certain, and she kissed him back with a thoroughness and an honesty that matched everything else about her. Her free hand coming up to the back of his neck and holding there. And the fire crackled, and the willows moved, and the river ran its course in the dark below them. When they broke apart, she looked at him with an expression that he could not name precisely, but that did something irreversible to him, and she said, "We need to sleep. Thornwall is tomorrow." "I know," he said. "I am not finished with this conversation." "I know that too," he said, and she looked at him steadily for one more moment and then nodded, a single decisive nod, the way she decided everything, and moved to her bedroll. He lay awake a good while longer than she did, looking at the willows and the stars above them, and he was grinning so widely that he was glad the dark hid it. Thornwall was a market town of perhaps 2,000 people, walled in old gray stone with a new gatehouse that someone had built with ambition and a limited understanding of mortar. The arbitration council sat in the old church on the main square, which had been converted to civic use when the original congregation moved to a bigger building, and it operated on 3 days a week and had a clerk who was, as clerks of legal bodies generally are, both essential and convinced of his own importance. They arrived in the morning with the documents in Simon's saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth, and a small crowd of the usual sort assembled in the market square around their passage through it, not hostile, exactly, but loud in a way that made merchants' ears go back. "Orc scout in Thornwall," someone said, loud enough to be intentional. Simon looked at Sharamph. She was walking straight ahead with her pack over her shoulder and her eyes forward. "Keep moving," she said very quietly. "I know," he said. The clerk at the council building took one look at them and said very carefully that the council was not currently in session and that there was a formal scheduling process. "I need to speak with Arbitrator Dunstan," Simon said. "My name is Simon Holloway. I am a licensed Eastern Range trader. I have a co-petitioner and documents pertaining to an imminent treaty violation that will trigger a war within 72 hours. The Thornwall Accord, Clause 14, allows for emergency session in cases where delay would result in armed conflict. We are invoking that clause." The clerk blinked. Sharamph said from behind Simon in a voice that was entirely polite, "Please inform Arbitrator Dunstan. The Ironhide clan would be grateful." The clerk went. They waited in the anteroom. Simon sat on the bench. Sharamph stood, which was her usual preference, and they did not speak, and the clock on the wall ticked, and the morning light came through the high windows and made rectangles of gold on the stone floor. Merritt Dunstan came herself. She was a tall woman, late 60s, white-haired and spare, with the brisk bearing of someone who has very little time and spends it all on things that matter. She looked at Simon and she looked at Sharamph and she looked at the saddlebag. "I remember you," she said to Simon. "Otter pelts, waterway rights." "I remember you," he said. She looked at the documents he laid out before her, and she read them with a focused silence that lasted 20 minutes, and neither of them spoke while she read, and at the end of it she set the last page down and looked at Sharamph. "You are representing the Ironhide clan," she said. "I am the Ironhide clan's envoy, yes," Sharamph said, "and the war leader is prepared to hold his war band pending arbitration. For 4 days, which is now 3. Dunstan looked at the letters between Hale and the surveyor. She picked up the payment ledger and ran her finger down a column of figures. She set it back down. "This is not a close case," she said. "It is, in fact, the clearest documentary evidence of deliberate survey fraud I have seen in 30 years on this council." She stood. "I will convene the full council this afternoon. Holloway, you will present the evidence as co-petitioner. Ironhide clan envoy, you will provide your clan's witness testimony." "I prepared a deposition," Sharamph said, and produced 3 pages of old paper from her pack, covered in the tight, precise script Simon had watched her write by firelight, and handed them across the table. Dunstan took them, looked at the first page, and her expression did something brief and complicated. "You came prepared." "I always come prepared," Sharamph said. "Good," said Dunstan. "So do I," and she walked out. The hearing lasted 5 hours. Simon presented the documents with the systematic precision of a man who has been preparing arguments in his head for 4 days straight, cross-referencing dates and distances and legal definitions with a clarity that he did not know he was capable of until he was doing it. And Sharamph sat at the petitioner's table beside him and answered questions from the 3-person council in the common tongue with an intelligence and a control that he could see impressing even the council members who had started the session with visible skepticism. Dunstan asked the hard questions and let both of them answer. She asked about the assault charge from Ashfin. Sharamph described it without inflection or defensiveness, detail by measured detail. She asked about the burial ground. Simon produced the survey party route log that Darvell had given them, which placed Hale's surveyors 40 feet into protected ground 3 days prior. She asked about the chain of custody for the correspondence. Simon explained it in full. At the end of the 5th hour, Dunstan retired with the council. Simon and Sharamph sat in the anteroom again. The afternoon light was long now, orange through the west windows. "We did what we could," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was good work." She looked at him. She had been running on focus and precision for 5 hours, and under that he could see the weight of it, what was riding on this, the ridge she had described in the morning light, the cousin's knife at her hip. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the bench, and she turned her hand over and held his and said nothing, and neither did he. They sat like that until the clerk came back, 30 minutes later, with a face that gave nothing away. The council reconvened. Dunstan stood. The Thornwall Arbitration Council finds that the eastern survey boundary east of the Grayville River has been illegally advanced on 16 documented occasions over the period in question, in violation of the Boundary Stability Clause of the Thornwall Accord. The surveys were conducted in service of a private prospecting interest held by Lord Carrick Hale, who has used Crown Survey authority to advance a private claim in a manner explicitly prohibited by the Accord. The Council finds all boundary markers placed east of the original 902 line null and void. The original boundary is hereby restored. A pause. Lord Hale's prospecting grant is suspended pending a full Crown review. A copy of these findings will be sent to the Crown Legal Office today. An enforcement order will be delivered to Hale's surveying firm before the week is out. She looked up from the page. The Ironhide clan retains full territorial rights to all land east of the 902 line. No further survey activity may be conducted in the contested territory without new Accord approval. Silence in the chamber. Then Dunstan said, looking directly at Simon, "Well argued, Holloway." "And at Sharamph, your deposition was exemplary." Sharamph stood. Her spine was very straight and her hands were still, and she said, "Thank you." And it came out with a dignity and a controlled weight that made it more than those 2 words. Outside, in the market square of Thornwall, the late afternoon sun was hitting the stones with a warm horizontal light, and the market was winding down around them, vendors packing stalls, wagons pulling out, the domestic clatter of an ordinary day ending, and Simon stood with his saddlebag over one shoulder and looked at Sharamph, who had stopped in the middle of the square and was standing with her face turned up to the sun, her eyes closed, and her hands still at her sides. He let her have that moment. He stood beside her and waited, and when she opened her eyes they were very bright. "Pell's message to Gorek," she said. "If he held the warband as I asked, and I believe he will have held it, then the warband is standing ready and has been told to wait on news from me. I need to get word to him." She turned to look at Simon. "I need to go east, to the Crookback." "Yes," she paused. "I could go directly from here. It is faster without the wagon." He knew that. He had known it since she said they needed to get word to Gorek, because he was good at thinking 3 moves ahead. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the market square continued its wind down around them, unhurried and uninterested. "Or," he said. She waited. "Or I come with you. As the human advocate of record for the arbitration ruling, my presence when you present the outcome to Gorek may be useful. It adds credibility to the ruling. It shows the Ironhide war leader that there is a human who stood before the council and argued this case and has personal stake in the outcome." Sharamph looked at him for a moment. "You want to come? I am telling you it is strategically sound. That is not what I asked." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "I want to come." She studied him. A slow, deliberate study, the full attention kind that she gave to things that mattered to her. Then she said, "Gorek is not an easy man. Most war leaders are not. He will test you. People usually do. He will not make it comfortable. I do not need comfortable." She turned toward the east gate of Thornwall and said over her shoulder, "Keep pace." He went to collect merchant. They made good time going east from Thornwall, with the arbitration ruling in the saddlebag, and a light pack apiece, taking the north road that cut toward the Crookback more directly than the river route. The countryside was familiar to him through here. He had traded along this corridor in the early years, and he drove with an ease that came from knowing the road. And Sharamph moved beside the wagon with her long, even stride, and they talked more easily than they had in the first 2 days, the way people talk when something large and urgent has been resolved, and there is room for something smaller and true. She told him about the Ironhide clan, not the political structure or the territory, but the ordinary daily life of it, the way the morning fire was tended by the eldest woman of each family group, and the way the scouts rotated in pairs so no one ranged alone, and the annual gathering at the anvil where the whole clan came together and spent 3 days in competition and stories and collective memory. Her voice when she spoke of it was not soft, because her voice was never soft, but it was warm in a way that did not require softness. He told her about the years before the Eastern Range, growing up in a mid-sized market town 3 days west, the second son of a cloth merchant, learning early that he was not suited to the town and the trade and the expectation of it, leaving at 18 with a modest stake and a license he had saved for, and finding, gradually and somewhat accidentally, that what he was suited for was the road itself, the route, the being in between things. "You are not lonely in it," she said. It was not a question. She had been listening carefully. Not in the ranging, no, he looked at the road ahead, in the stopping sometimes. "When I come in from the deep range and I am in a town and I watch people eat supper together through windows," he paused, "but I have never found the thing that makes the stopping feel the same as the ranging." She was quiet for a moment. What would that take? He looked at her sidelong. She was looking straight ahead. The evening was coming in around them, the light going long and amber. "Someone who understood both," he said, "the going and the staying. Someone who was not afraid of the range and did not need me to be less of what I am in order to fit." Sharamph kept walking. After a moment she said, "I have lived in the same 5 ridges my whole life, and it has never felt small to me. The Crookback Range is larger than most people know. There is more in it than any one person can fully know in a lifetime." Another pause. "But there is something I understand about what you are describing, the being in the road between things. I have felt it when I range far enough from the main encampment that I am between the known places. There is a particular kind of freedom in it." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She turned her head and looked at him, and in the amber evening light she was something that he felt in the part of himself that had been quiet and alone for a long time, a recognition, specific and certain. He looked back at her, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more right away, and Merchant walked on through the evening with his big placid hooves on the north road, and the Crookback drew closer in the east. They made camp at a waystone that night, the last marked stop before the Crookback territory proper, and after supper she came to sit beside him, not across the fire but beside him, and she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her in the cooling air, and she leaned her shoulder against his in a manner that was deliberate and easy both, and he turned his head and she was right there, and she kissed him this time, which was different, harder and more honest, with both hands on his face in the manner of someone who has decided something fully and is not reconsidering, and he kissed her back with everything he had, and she made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite anything else, and pulled him closer with the easy strength that was simply her natural state. They were there a long time, the fire burning low around them and the waystone at their backs and the night full of the Eastern Range sounds, and at some point she said against his jaw, "I do not make a habit of this," and he said, "I know," and she said, "I mean specifically this, allowing someone this close." "I know," he said again. "You are not surprised. I noticed from the first day that you do not do anything without deciding to." She was quiet a beat. "That is correct, another beat. I have been deciding for several days." "What did you decide?" She pulled back enough to look at him, and the firelight was behind her and her eyes were very dark and certain. "That I want you," she said, simply and plainly, the way she said everything that mattered to her. "That you are, I do not have a word in the common tongue for what you are to me. In the Ironhide dialect there is a word, Varect. It means the person who fits the space that you did not know was there. He looked at her. He felt the word settle into him like something solid, like a keystone going into an arch. I will remember that word, he said. Good, she said, and kissed him again. The fire burned down to coals, and the stars came out above the waystone, and the eastern range was dark and quiet around them. Gorek Ironhide's warband was camped in the pass at the mouth of the Crookback, and it was a formidable sight, 120 orc warriors in full-range gear, their campfires laid out in the careful pattern that indicated a holding position rather than a march, which meant Pell's message had gotten through and the war leader had chosen to wait. Simon had seen orc warbands before from a distance, as a fur trader who ranged deep east, but he had not ridden into the center of one, and he was aware of every set of eyes on him as they passed through the outer perimeter. Gorek Ironhide was older than Simon had imagined, past 60, built like a river stone, with a beard oiled and braided and eyes so like Sharamph's that the relationship was immediately clear. He did not look pleased to see a human riding in beside his niece, but he looked at Sharamph first, and the look he gave her was the look of a man who has been genuinely worried and is working hard not to show how much. Sharamph dismounted and went to him, and they spoke in the clan dialect for a moment, and then she turned. War leader, she said in the common tongue, this is Simon Holloway. He is the human advocate who presented our case before the Thornwall Arbitration Council. She reached into Simon's saddlebag and produced the ruling and handed it to Gorek. The survey lines are restored to the 902 boundary. Hale's grant is suspended. The ruling is binding. Gorek read it. Simon sat on Merchant and was very still. The war leader looked up. He looked at Simon with the frank, hard appraisal of a man who has spent 60 years deciding whether other men were worth trusting. You argued this, he said. Yes. Why? Simon had been expecting the question. Because the law was being used to take what was not the Crown's to take, and I had the tools to say so. The land east of the 902 line is Ironhide land under the Accord. I range that territory. I know it the way I know my own hands. It would be wrong to let it be stolen. He met the war leader's gaze. I also had personal interest. My root is worth nothing if there is a war. Honest, Gorek said. I try to be. The war leader looked at Sharamph. Something passed between them in the clan dialect, brief and low. Sharamph said something back that included Simon's name and the word Varect, and Gorek's eyebrow went up, and he looked at Simon again with a new quality to the appraisal. Then he turned to his assembled war band captains. He held up the ruling. He spoke in the clan dialect at length, and Simon did not follow all of it, but he caught the word for boundary restored and the word for justice, and once, toward the end, the word for ally, and the warband received it with a collective sound that was somewhere between relief and acknowledgement, the sound of 100 warriors who had been ready to fight and are told they do not have to, which is not the same as disappointment. It is the better sound. The one that happens when the thing worth protecting is preserved. Gorek looked at Simon. The Ironhide clan recognizes your advocate's service, he said. You have right of passage through our territory. Your charter is valid on all Ironhide roads. Thank you, war leader. Do not thank me, you earned it. He looked at Sharamph once more, and now there was unmistakably something in his expression that was warmer and less official, a flicker of something avuncular and quietly pleased. He said something brief to her in the clan dialect. She said something back, dry and short. He laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. She came back to where Simon sat on Merchant. He says you look like a mild wind would blow you over, she said, but he has been wrong about appearances before. That is high praise, Simon said. From Gorek, yes, she said. It is. They spent that night in the warband camp, and for the first time in a week Simon slept a full night without waking, the deep, boneless sleep of a man who has done what he came to do. He was aware, in the clean gray of the early morning when he woke, that the thing he had been carrying, the urgency and the tension and the awareness that it could all go wrong at any point, had set down somewhere in the night and was not on him anymore. He lay on his back in the camp with the crookback ridge above him in the early light, the rock faces going from black to gray to the first pale gold, and he thought about what Sharamph had said to Gorek, the word Varekt, offered without self-consciousness or hedging, just named and given and left to stand. She came to him at the edge of dawn, while the camp was still mostly asleep, and sat beside him with 2 cups of the clan's morning drink, something smoky and hot and unfamiliar, and handed one across, and he took it and they sat together looking at the ridge waking up. "The ruling will be enforced," she said low. "Gorek will send riders with copies today. The Crown Legal Office will have it within the week. Hail will be finished before the next moon." "Yes," Simon said, "and the warband stands down this morning." She paused. "It is done." "It is done," he said. The ridge was fully gold now above them, the anvil's flat top clear and bright, and he looked at it and thought about the 17-year-old who had climbed it in a blizzard for a belt knife, and then looked at the woman beside him who was that girl grown into something extraordinary, and felt the specific and irreversible nature of what had happened to him over the past 6 days. "I need to go back to the clan encampment," she said. "Give a full account to the family council. Return Gorek's formal report." She turned the cup in her hands. "And then I have decisions to make." "What decisions?" She looked at him. "I was exiled," she said, "from Crown Survey territory east of the Grayville first boundary marker north to south." He blinked. The exile. He had almost forgotten it in everything else. "Technically," he said slowly, "that exile was premised on the existence of a legal Crown Survey boundary which has now been ruled invalid and restored to the 902 line, which means the legal basis for your exile no longer exists," she said. "Yes," he looked at her. "The exile is moot." "Legally, yes." She was watching him carefully. "But I was thinking about it differently." He waited. "The exile sent me west of the Grayville. I then chose to go east of it into Orc territory, which is not the same as Crown territory and was never covered by the exile terms." She paused. "But then we traveled west again, to Fort Crail, and then to Thornwall, which I could only do because you argued the exile terms specifically enough that I was on the right side of the line." She set her cup down on the rock between them. "You argued my sentence down to something survivable." "I did," he said. "And then you spent 3 days in the borderlands with me, and came to Thornwall, and argued the case." She was looking at him directly. "Most people, having done the first thing, would have left me at the boundary marker and considered their duty done." "I did not want to leave," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the point." He looked at her in the growing light, the gold coming down off the anvil onto the camp, and he thought about the route and the ranging and the stopping and the word for the person who fits the space you did not know was there, and he said, "What is the decision you are thinking about?" She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "I have been second range scout for the Ironhide clan for 8 years, she said. "My territory is the Deep East. My role is known and established, and I am good at it." Paused. "I could stay in that role, come back to the 5 ridges and the anvil and the routes I know and resume what I was before this week." "Yes," he said, "you could." "Or," she said and stopped. "Or," he repeated very quietly. She picked up her cup again. "There is a thing done in the Ironhide clan when a scout chooses a partner who ranges beyond the clan territory. It is called claiming range. The scout stakes their territory to include the partner's range. It is considered a serious declaration." He was very still. "It is not a ceremony," she said. "It is a statement of intent. It requires no council approval. It is the scout's own declaration." She looked at the ridge. "I would be declaring that your range is my range, that where you go I range beside you." He understood what she was telling him. He understood the weight of it, what she was offering to give up, what she was choosing to walk into, and that she was making this choice in the particular way she made all her choices, fully, with eyes open, without hedging. "Sharamph," he said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. I have been alone for a long time. Not unhappily, I am not someone who is ruined by solitude, you know that about me, but I have been incomplete, in the way that you said. the space that you did not know was there. He held her gaze. You fit it from the first day. I do not know how to explain it better than that. You do not need to explain it better, she said. I want you to come with me, he said. On the route, to Fort Crail and back, and wherever the route goes, I want you beside me. I want whatever claiming range means. I want you to declare it if you want to declare it, and I will spend every day making sure you do not regret it. She looked at him for a long time in the full morning light, the camp stirring around them, the ridge blazing gold above, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, all the control and precision set down, the real thing underneath it showing plainly, which was that she wanted this, had wanted it and been deciding toward it for days and had arrived. Simon, she said. Yes, I am claiming range. He reached out and she put her hand in his, that large, warm, certain hand, and he held it with everything he had. They sat there as the warband woke around them, and the camp filled with the sounds of mourning, the crackle of fires being built up, the low voices of warriors preparing to stand down, the horses moving on their pickets, and the Crookback Ridge turned from gold to bright in the full sun, and the anvil stood flat-topped and clear above all of it, and Simon Holloway sat with Sharamph Ironhide's hand in his and felt, for the first time in as long as he could clearly remember, that he was not between things. He was somewhere. Gorek's warband began their formal stand-down at mid-morning, weapons peace-wrapped, captains dismissing their sections in the orderly manner of a disciplined force that has received clean orders, riders going out in pairs with copies of the arbitration ruling toward every corner of Ironhide territory. The war leader moved through it with the ease of a man returning to his preferred state, which was administration rather than combat, and Simon watched from a distance with a professional respect for the organization of it. Sharamph spent 2 hours with Gorek and 3 of the family council elders, delivering her full account: the arrest at Ashfin, Simon's argument, the route to Fort Crail, Darvell Oust's archive, the Thornwall hearing. Simon knew because she told him afterward, translating the relevant pieces with her characteristic precision. The council's response had been what she had expected. Formal recognition of the advocate Simon Holloway, formal thanks to Darvell Oust at Fort Crail, a rider sent south to Ashfin to formally notify the border court that Sharamph Ironhide's exile was moot under the ruling, and a quiet, private acknowledgement from Gorek of the claiming range declaration, delivered in a manner she described only as characteristic Gorek: brief, gruff, and underneath the gruff, genuine. He said, she told Simon in the dry tone she used for things that moved her, that he had always thought I ranged too small. Simon looked at her. He was right, he said. She looked at him sideways and her mouth curved. They spent one more night in the Crookback, at the family encampment, a different order of accommodation than the warband camp. This, a cluster of low stone and hide structures built into a south-facing slope with a long fire at the center, and the smell of wood smoke and cured leather and cooking food, the everyday life of a people in their place. Simon traded 2 beaver pelts and a coil of good rope for a night's hospitality, and felt the particular warmth of a trade that is also a welcome. And he sat at the long fire that night with Sharamph beside him and some dozen members of the Ironhide family groups around it. And though he caught perhaps 1 word in 5 of the conversation, he followed the warmth of it completely. Before the fire burned low, she told him, in the common tongue quietly between them, something she had not said before, that her mother had died when she was 12, which was why she had been raised partly by Gorek's household, and why the war leader's opinion of her mattered to her more than she usually let on. That the reason she ranged alone rather than in the scout pairs was not defiance of protocol, but a specific dispensation she had earned after demonstrating that her solo range results outperformed paired ones, which she said without pride, merely as a fact of record. That the Keld River Bridge had frightened her more than she had shown, not for herself, but because she had seen him go over the railing, and in the 3 seconds before she had his wrist she had been very afraid. You did not show it, he said. No, she said. I am glad you had my wrist." "So am I," she said, and the way she said it was quiet and direct and carried a weight that she did not elaborate on and did not need to. He looked at the fire, and then at her, and she was looking at him already, and it was the private kind of looking, the kind that does not need an audience, and he reached up and touched her face, the scar, gently, with 2 fingers, the trace of it from her cheekbone down, and she let him, with the stillness of someone accepting something freely given. And then she turned her head and pressed her lips to his palm, and that was that. They left the Crookback at dawn, the 2 of them and Merchant, heading west along the 902 boundary line with the arbitration ruling logged, and the route open, and the Crookback Ridge behind them gold in the morning light. He had a resupply to complete at 3 clan stops along the western corridor, and she knew every one of those stops and the best paths between them, and at each one they traded together, him with the pelts and the rope, her with the fluent clan dialect and the Ironhide recognition, which turned out to be a more powerful currency than he had expected in those particular markets. The trades were clean and good, and the road between stops was full of the easy-ranging talk of 2 people who move well together, argument and observation, and the quiet of shared miles and occasional laughter at things that needed no explanation to either of them. At the second clan stop, a more substantial settlement at a river crossing, with a proper trading hall and a smithy, the head trader, a big orc man named Cag with a skeptical manner and gold rings in both ears, looked at the 2 of them for a long moment before starting negotiations and said to Sharamph, in common tongue clearly intended for Simon's ears, "This is the advocate from Thornwall." "Yes," Sharamph said. Cag looked at Simon. He seemed to come to a conclusion. "Good work," he said, and began the trade. Outside afterward, Simon said, "The Eastern Range talks fast." "I told you," Sharamph said, and she was smiling. They reached the Grayville River at the end of the 5th day of the return journey, which was 10 days since Ashfin, and stood at the western bank where the 902 survey stone stood square and straight and newly significant, and looked at it together. "You can cross freely," Simon said. "I know," she said. "The exile is moot." Still, he looked at the stone. "First time back across." She looked at it for a moment. Then she stepped across the river shallow here at a ford, the water cold and fast and clean, and stood on the western bank and turned back to look at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, and brought Merchant across. Ashfin was a day west of the Grayville, and they went through it rather than around it, because Simon had the pelts still unsold and a resupply to complete, and because he was not the sort of man who went around a thing when going through. It was the honest choice. They rode in on the eastern road in the early afternoon, and Simon took the furs to the market straight away with the brisk efficiency of a man finishing a job, and Sharamph walked through the market with him because she did not have anything to prove about being in Ashfin, and nobody knew what to do with that. The magistrate's hall was on the south side of the square, and as they passed it, Simon looked up at it for a moment, thinking of nothing in particular, and Sharamph looked at it too, and he said, "Different outcome than last time." "Every outcome," she said, "was different from what might have been." He looked at her. She was looking at the hall with her characteristic straight face, but her eyes were warm in the way he had learned to read. "Are you glad I spoke?" he said. She turned to look at him, and in the market square of Ashfin, with the stalls and the noise and the ordinary afternoon going on around them, she looked at him with the full, unguarded openness that he had only seen in private until now, in full daylight, in front of anyone who cared to look. "Yes," she said, "I am glad." He reached out and she put her hand in his, and they stood in the square like that for a moment, and some people looked and some people did not, and neither of them cared particularly either way. That evening they camped east of Ashfin, back in the borderlands, on the open ground they both knew better than walls. He made the fire the way she had taught him, small, contained, right wood, and she made the tea the way she had been making it since the second night, 2 cups, handed across without comment. They sat together with their shoulders touching and the borderlands dark and quiet around them and the stars overhead in their impossible density, and the marten and beaver calls in the distance and the wind in the dry grass, all the sounds of a world they both knew and moved through and were made for. Fort Crail, she said. Darvel said she wanted to expand the trading hall, he said. Bigger storage, more regular trade routes. She asked me the last morning whether I would consider a regular stop. Would you? I said I would think about it. He looked at the fire. I think the answer is yes. It makes sense as an anchor on the route, a regular stop, a known relationship, room to store a season's take. He paused, and it is a good place, the kind of place that is becoming something. It is, she said. We would need a room there, he said. She was quiet a beat. We, she said. We, he said, another beat. A room. Darvel has rooms, she said so. She did say so, Sharamph said, with a quality to her voice that was warm and dry in equal parts, which was, he had come to understand, her version of openly delighted. And from Fort Crail, he said, the Crookback is 3 days east, which is not far. Not far at all, she said. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him. And the fire was low between them, and the borderlands were dark on all sides, and the stars were what they always were out here. Impossible and indifferent and overwhelmingly beautiful. And she put her hand on the back of his neck, and drew him toward her and kissed him with the warmth and the directness and the unhurried certainty of someone who has made a final decision and is at peace with it. And he kissed her back with everything in him. All the years of the ranging and the roots and the alone, all of it finally coming to rest in this particular person, this one she had called Varekt, the one who fits the space you did not. No was there. They sat together late into the night, close and easy, talking and not talking in equal measure, the way two people talk when they have run out of things to prove to each other and can simply be. She told him the name of every peak of the Crookback that she could see from the fire if it were daylight, and what each one meant in the clan memory, and he told her the full extent of his route, every clan stop, every waypost, every tributary crossing, as if he were handing it to her, which in a way he was. She told him about the Ironhide clan's winter gathering, the one at the anvil, and what it involved, and he said he would like to see it, and she said she would take him, and he could feel that she meant it simply and fully. He told her about the feeling of the deep range in the first snow, when the world goes quiet in a particular way, and you are the only thing moving in it, and she said, yes, I know exactly that. And he said, I know you do. When they finally lay down, she settled against him with the ease of someone taking their place, her head on his shoulder and her hand on his chest, and he put his arm around her and looked up at the stars, and felt not happy, exactly, though that was part of it, complete. The particular quality of completeness that comes when you have been carrying something a long time without knowing it, and you set it down and feel the absence of the weight. Dawn came in slowly, the way Borderlands dawn always comes, gray first and then rose and then gold from the east, from the direction of the Crookback. He was awake before her, watching it come in, watching the pale light move across the open country and pick out the shapes of the dry grass and the distant ridges and the 902 boundary stone visible half a mile away, standing quiet in the new day. She woke a few minutes after him. He felt it in the small change in her breathing, the slight shift of her body toward full wakefulness, and she lay still for a moment and then tilted her head back to look at him. Morning, he said. Morning, she said. They looked at the dawn coming in together. The gold was full now, hitting the peaks of the Crookback in the far east, the anvil standing flat-topped and bright, and the whole of the borderlands were lit and clean and enormous around them, and there was no one else in any direction that they could see. He thought about Ashvin and the courtroom and the sentence and the woman in chains who had not looked afraid, who had looked outraged and alive, who had looked at him across a crowded room and decided something without saying it. He thought about the bridge and the ford and the 5 days of road between two places and the word Varekt, and the woman who had said it to her uncle without ceremony, as plain and certain as anything she had ever said. He thought about the space he had not known was there, and how it felt now, full. Sharamph sat up and reached for the water skin and took a long drink and handed it across to him, the way she always did, small and domestic and certain. This woman who feared nothing and could have chosen anyone and had chosen him, again and again, across 6 days of road and argument and bridges and courtrooms and stars. "I am going to need to restock at Ashfin," he said. "I know," she said. "I need boot oil and fletching cord. I know where the market stall is." "I know you do." She stood, pulling her hair back and retying the leather braid with the quick efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 mornings. Then she looked east at the crookback and north at the road and then at him, and she said, "Let us go." He stood. He kicked the fire down. He hitched Merchant in the rose-gold morning. She packed the bedrolls with the speed and the precision that was simply how she did everything. And she slung her pack and settled her knife and looked at him where he sat up on the wagon seat with the reins loose in his hands and the open road ahead. She stepped up beside him on the wagon seat, which was not something she had done before. She had always walked, and she settled beside him with her shoulder against his and looked at the road with the particular settled quality that he recognized as contentment. And he looked at her briefly and then at the road, and he clicked to Merchant, and they went. The borderlands opened around them in the full morning light, vast and rugged and old and alive, the country they both knew and moved through and were made for, and the road went forward into all of it, and there was nothing in it that was not theirs.